Great. Well, hi, everybody. My name's Betsy Boughton. I'm the Program Director of Agroecology at Buck Island Ranch. And today we have a special seminar speaker, Dr. Alia DeLong. And she's a research social scientist at Archbold's Buck Island Ranch. She's been working here for about 3 years now. Before starting her work here at Archbold, she earned her PhD from the University of Florida in 2020, focusing on community food systems, food insecurity, farmer decision-making, and food justice. And she did a lot of work on strawberry production in Florida. And there, her work bridged social science and agroecology research, emphasizing stakeholder engagement and inclusive approaches to agricultural sustainability. So the focus of her work at Archbold was on our work in the long-term agroecosystem research network, the LTAR that you see on the screen, that is run by the US Department of Agriculture. And her focus there was working with the Human Dimensions group and the engagement working groups. And that was her role, to be this network social scientist. And what she did was she played a large role in advancing LTAR. And there's a lot of environmental scientists in LTAR, so having social scientists join the network and help us really understand the holistic sustainability of agroecosystems is something that we're striving for. And so Alia helped us to do that. So we want to look at all the domains of sustainability: production, economics, environmental, and society. And so we really benefited having Alia in the network. And in the network, she did a lot of contributions, but like some of her main ones was the development of the social indicators. And then she and others with Taylor from Kellogg and a big group formed a stakeholder engagement toolbox so that other sites can do stakeholder engagement. So that was really helpful. So at our site, Archbold Biological Station and University of Florida LTAR site, she led the formation of our Stakeholder Advisory Council. And our advisory council included ranchers, technical advisors, state and federal agencies, and NGOs. And that was a way that we were able to formally incorporate stakeholder engagement and expertise into our research at our LTAR site. So Alia really added that scientific rigor to the stakeholder engagement. Prior to that, we were doing a lot of informal stakeholder engagement. So I'm really going to miss that. Alia, having you part of our team really made our team well-rounded, and to be able to address that social side. She also collaborated with many LTAR sites on different studies. So for example, she looked at community security challenges in the beef industry in collaboration with the University of Idaho. And she worked with Jornada in New Mexico to investigate the effectiveness of different types of stakeholder engagement. So I invite you all to pick Alia's brain about stakeholder engagement. And thank you, Alia, for all your contributions to Archbold and to LTAR. I know you were involved with the community and culture group quite a lot here at Archbold. So we just really appreciated that, and we're going to miss you. And Alia is going on to a position at the US Forest Service to work with the human dimensions of pine restoration. So she won't be far. She'll be in the Southeast still, working mostly in Georgia and North Florida. So I guess I'll turn it over to Alia. And the title of her talk is Engaging Community Partners in Research and the Co-Production of Science.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. That was really kind. I do have a thank you slide. I might save it for last though, in case I have some unexpected fears. Okay, so I'm really excited to be here and share a little bit more about what social science looks like. What? Oh, okay.
Will, can you stop sharing, please? Okay, sorry.
Okay. All right, let me know if that's good, because I can't see the chat. So hi. Excited to talk to you all today about how I've been able to be an incorporator of social science into stakeholder engagement as it has been at Archbold, which already has a lot of really valuable relationships with community partners and stakeholders. So it really has been a pleasure to meet and work with all of the people in the region and the different stakeholders and work together. So what I'm going to talk about today, the first thing, my main priority is to talk about what the co-production of science is and what stakeholder engagement is. And then I do have a couple of examples, but I'm going to pause if you have any questions after the co-production part, because I want to make sure for some, it might be a completely new concept. For others, they've been intimately involved during this process. So we have quite the range of experience. Okay. So working with partners and stakeholders to co-produce knowledge. So I wanted to go ahead and define stakeholder. What we mean when we say that is someone who has a stake in the outcome of a research project. So that could be research products, deliverables, anything that we're disseminating, people who use those items, sometimes referred to as end users. These are people who have different types of knowledge that they can contribute if they were to join a research team. So in the perspective of co-production of science, we're really looking at how can we broaden our perspective on what science looks like to make it more rigorous at the biophysical level. Making sure I don't forget anything. I do have some notes. All right, so overall, why would we want to do stakeholder engagement? So I've touched on that a little bit now, but essentially we can use knowledge from multiple sources, multiple experts to create new knowledge that no individual group could have done on its own. So we get the accumulated experiential knowledge from farmers and ranchers when they are invited to be members of the research team. We also get on the ground experiential knowledge from service providers. So that includes IFAS extension and other crop advisors in different service provider groups. And then of course we have the experimental knowledge that comes from the research scientists themselves. So we're really thinking about this as expanding the research team so that we can all contribute together. And the idea is that when we work together like this, we can expedite the production of innovations and the transfer of new knowledge. So here's a definition that is kind of an overview of the umbrella of the co-production of knowledge. So the contribution of multiple knowledge sources and capacities from different stakeholders, spanning the science policy society interface, with the goal of co-creating knowledge and information to inform environmental decision-making. So it's working together, different groups of experts, and we can make better decisions together. One hallmark of co-production is going to be that it is iterative. There is no start and end. It's something that moves along a path, not always linear, Stakeholders learn from scientists as much as scientists learn from stakeholders. There's that aspect of two-directional learning. And we also engage in the co-production of knowledge to transform what might be traditional knowledge into something that can be transformative instead of relying on old ways and methods. But at the same time, we do collaborate as different groups of experts to combine all of that together. Okay, so if we think about the co-production under what conditions and what needs to happen for this to be successful. You're working on a research project together, making decisions together. What are the things that you need to consider when you're putting a team together, when you're pursuing your research goals? And so one is to make sure that there is a broad representation of partners and stakeholders. And that early on in the process, there is a shared understanding and a common purpose to move towards. And this is to make sure that we adequately capture all of the values and the perspectives, and we do that by finding a shared understanding of the science. Additionally, setting clear boundaries from the start about who is incorporating what kind of knowledge at what stage in the research process to make sure that collaboration is as effective as possible. And this also allows the contributions from different stakeholders to be at a greater depth. And one aspect that is always a struggle is just the flexibility that is needed when you're working with stakeholders to adapt to whatever changing conditions are happening. But most of all, as long as there is a movement towards the shared understanding of all of the groups involved, we're going to improve the research process. So here is a figure I just wanted to share that kind of has an overview of the different steps of meaningful co-production of science. So it starts with identifying key actors and building relationships. So at Archbold, a lot of these were established relationships that we were able to engage with immediately. And then again, building common ground, having something that we're working towards together so that we can co-explore what needs to happen in research and also co-develop the solutions that are the outcomes and outputs of a research study. And then in the with the idea of dissemination, also co-delivering solutions to a wider network of people when we all are bringing our own networks to the same table. And finally, an evaluation process to reassess the effectiveness of the engagement process and make any changes. And it continues, and it continues, and it continues. Excuse me. Okay. I'll point out what's important. Don't worry about reading this in particular, but as you can imagine, there are different levels of stakeholder engagement that a research team and stakeholders can realistically contribute to a research project. None of us have all of the time in the world. And so a lot of times at different stages of research, there are going to be different levels of engagement. And so on the far right, in this this continuum, we have stakeholder-led research. So this is the extreme where researchers are not involved at all. Stakeholders are at the helm completely. And then at the opposite end, we have only scientists involved. There's no kind of connection to the stakeholder groups, no stakeholders involved. And then there are other levels that we kind of move throughout as a research project progresses. So a lot of times through informal engagement, stakeholder informed research on this continuum is probably happening more often than not, because scientists talk to people and people talk to scientists, and the ideas get exchanged, even if it's not fully documented or formalized. And so stakeholder consultation is a little bit more involvement from the stakeholders, where they have an opportunity to give feedback or provide input that contributes to a research project. And next we have stakeholder participation, which means that the stakeholders have a defined role in the research process. Stakeholder initiated is an instance where a stakeholder has an idea that they bring to a scientist who then pursues that research, who would not have otherwise pursued that research without the stakeholder. And then we have co-production, which is sometimes viewed as an ideal. It is shared decision-making. And if you've ever tried to make a decision in a room full of scientists, it's very hard. So when you add a lot of other groups of people as well, it's going to be hard. And so that is where this degree of collaboration abacus comes in. So this would be an example for determining the scientist and the stakeholder roles throughout each step of the research process, from developing research questions all the way through creating academic and public products. In the way research teams can use this abacus is, each person is represented by a dot on the abacus, and you place yourself along the line based on how much responsibility and how much voice you personally want to contribute. This is just an example. These are all made up for the sake of a visual. Okay, and so we have this graphic here is going to show the variables of co-production. So there are a lot of different considerations, I guess, that a research team will have to make along the way. And a question that we hear a lot is like, okay, here's stakeholder engagement, co-production is this great thing to do. I don't know how to do it. How am I supposed to know how to do that? So this is just an overview of one model that exists that shows what the practical variables are in co-production. So I don't particularly need to go too in detail to this model, but you have context that is going to be integral to setting up the success of your project. Each institution is going to have its own level of resources and time that it's able to contribute to having a successful co-production of science program. And then there are also the inputs, which often are the people contributing knowledge. And then the process, which encompasses activities and outputs, is where the data collection happens. It's where everyone is in the room together, making decisions, and this ultimately impacts the outcomes, or it leads to the outcomes and impacts of the co-production process, which in some cases can be a beneficial change in behavior. And a lot of times it's that we have more relevant information that we then feed back into the cycle of co-production. Okay, how's everyone feeling? This is where I wanted to pause and ask if anyone had questions about the concepts, because I know I just went through a lot and it was like pretty fast. Yes, Zach.
Yeah, one question. On the wheel that you had about like the 6 steps, 5th was co-deliver solutions. And I guess just even, and I'm sure you'll give examples of that, so maybe jump in the gun, but just curious, is that's all the stakeholders involved in that participation group collectively help, like, disseminate or implement or get it out into the world? That's really what that is?
Yes, so for people online, the question was about step 5 on this wheel in co-delivering solutions and what that looks like. Yeah, so when you have a group of stakeholders coming from different backgrounds, so you'll have ranchers, maybe you'll have someone from extension, someone from a conservation nonprofit, and you have automatically increased your reach. So co-delivering services solutions is about not only how many people we're reaching, but how many more people we're reaching that we weren't before. If that helps. Yes.
So considering that this is a continuous cycle, what are the triggers for reopening a study, and are those articulated within the results of studies?
Okay, so your question was what triggers the involvement of stakeholders, like revisiting something to then involve stakeholders in? So the context in which I have done co-production of science has always been in agricultural systems that involve delivering some kind of product that will ultimately help farmers and ranchers make more informed decisions at the level of their operation. And so like co-production of science isn't always going to be relevant to every scientific discipline. Basic research, I don't think that there's an appropriate role necessarily for stakeholder engagement in the ways that we're doing where we're developing solutions together. So it really can depend on the context and like I guess the legacy of the project at hand too, whether there's like the feasibility of revisiting something with stakeholders.
This one's funny, maybe. Can you call someone a stakeholder if they may benefit from the info, but they don't utilize it?
Yes, so we have stakeholder representation, but there are groups that are not represented. So the general public could be a group that we would invite to participate in the co-production process. But what we're looking for when we recruit stakeholders is some kind of expertise in the subject matter, whether it's experiential or experimental. So it kind of depends on like the scope of the study, and the research team will kind of agree at the start of a project which stakeholders to invite versus not invite based on the scope of the information that we're collecting. Yes, Hillary.
I'd like to, could you go a couple on? That was a slide with the outcomes and the salient knowledge.
Yes.
Yeah, but which I actually like very much from a research point of view. Where I personally always struggle is if this is an experiment and you're expecting I'm making up more productivity from grass or a better understanding of fire regime, you know, that is a beneficial change in the practice. But the outcomes often intersect with lots of other outcomes and they can aggregate up. And I always struggle with, yes, we can change this outcome on this one thing, but that may have really important effects on 2 or 3 other things that are sort of not part of this process. Or for example, you know, it could have a strong educational value. So I'm just saying one of the areas, and it's not a criticism, but one of the areas I find quite hard is that outcomes impact is always a tangled web itself.
Mm-hmm.
And differentiating, you know, it has a danger. I'm not arguing, I'm not saying that, but it has a danger to make it silo. What is the outcome of this project? But the reality is we are always struggling with all of these other intersections. So I'm just, I do struggle with it from that point of view.
Yes. So for people online, the comment was about how the outcomes and impacts are often tangled together and you can't pull one thread to figure out what one decision was made that you can confidently attribute to a research project. And how then, when you're just looking at research outputs, how can you address the fact that this leads to siloed research? Yeah.
Well, that would be one concern I have. Maybe a flip side is how do you adequately address that it might touch lots of tangents?
Okay, how do you address that it might impact a bunch of different tangents? So a lot of this comes with social science methodology. Basically, since we can't collect data with a form like that, check this box if. A lot of times the qualitative data analysis will require explanations from stakeholders about how one decision triggered another decision, And then you can use qualitative coding to map out where among research participants did they have a common response to try to identify like nodes, I guess, nodes of information. I don't know if realistically it's possible or even desirable to extract one outcome from the greater context. So I don't have an answer for how to do that other than getting detailed information from doctors of science will help us identify what processes are happening that lead to, say, adoption or non-adoption, or whatever the variable we're looking at is. Okay. And so I do have some examples. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick overview of what the long-term agroecosystem research network is, just very brief. Archbold is part of a dual site with the University of Florida Range Cattle Research and Education Center in Ona. And this is a research network that was formed in 2012 that combined sites across the US in different agroecological systems that had long-term research kind of form a network so that they can use their collective data to address questions of at multiple scales, the changes in agricultural performance over time. So I believe that about, or that the average number of years any given site has been collecting data is 50 years. So these are very long-term projects and have a long-term future as well. So here's a map. We currently have 19 sites across the US, and you can see where they are on the map, as well as whether or not they are a cropland, a grazing land, or an integrated system. And one hallmark of the LTAR network is the common experiment, where we have a prevailing practice that we used to describe as business as usual, but prevailing practices compared to aspirational practices, which are looking at solutions for a more sustainable future in agroecosystems. And so one of the priorities when conducting this long-term science is the inclusion of stakeholders. And so this is from the LTAR strategic plan, which shows the different elements that we're looking at when we do engage stakeholders and partners, which is producing tools that are useful, usable, and used. And we can do this through actually producing tools with our end users, making sure that information is translated appropriately, conduct research with our stakeholders, as well as make sure that we're sharing and publishing our data and findings. And one part of this priority for the inclusion of stakeholders is so that our science is guided by the folks who will end up using our research and using our science. Maybe it's not even a particular product, but it includes all of the information that we deliver. Okay. So I mentioned that Archbold and the University of Florida comprise one site. For our common experiment, we have one research question that guides our science. How does innovative management affect cow-calf production and multiple ecosystem services across a land use intensity gradient? And so when we engage with stakeholders as a part of an LTAR site, this is the overarching context for the decisions that we're making. Okay. So Betsy mentioned this in my introduction, but we started an LTAR advisory council in 2022. And so this was an initial image that we put together when we were looking at how do we as a group co-produce knowledge, the different aspects that we're going to need to consider throughout the process. So the input or the guidance from the stakeholders, also what we're outputting, which is hopefully useful tools. We also wanted to make sure that our research was flexible enough that we can shift to topics as the stakeholders see fit and kind of take their direction on innovative management. And so here are the stakeholders that we did engage with the LTAR Advisory Council. So we had ranchers present, technical advisors such as UF-IFAS Extension, NRCS, Florida Department of Agriculture, South Florida Water Management District, and as our nonprofit, the Nature Conservancy. So throughout our meetings, which we have met twice a year since 2022, these are the main groups that will have been represented. And here's a timeline of from the formation of the advisory council through where we are today. So this is just pointing out a couple of things. For example, the different meetings that we held, also different deliverables that are kind of the traditionally rewarded deliverables. We were able to nominate our stakeholder group for an award that they did receive. So we were able to highlight the important work of our stakeholders at Archbold at a network level within LTAR. We also obtained additional funding to continue this research for a fourth year. And most recently, we did submit a grant to explore innovative management practices that were guided by the Advisory Council. So in terms of the kind of methods that we used and the kind of results that came out, the results that came out of that, these are the social science methodologies or approaches that we've used during our meetings. Not expecting you to understand the definition of each of these, but over the last 3 years, we've met 6 times, and each time we have built upon the previous meeting's results, and it continues at an iterative process, Okay, now I have an example. So one of the methods that we used is called the nominal group technique. And I will just add, this is a lot of information that we've collected and that we have yet to analyze, excuse me. So there was a lot of information to choose from when I was putting this together. And I had about 60 slides and figured maybe I needed to cut back a little bit. So I'm going to give you an example of something that has an associated publication in case you want to learn more about it. And that is using the nominal group technique to conduct collaborative science. Here is a figure of what the nominal group technique, what the method outlines in terms of steps. And so it's a little small. Don't expect you to read this, but the point is that there is a structured consensus building methodology that facilitates our collaborative science. And so that goes from step one of focusing, so brainstorming on different ideas. Focusing on the science that provides the context for the advisory council decision-making. And then we ask stakeholders to brainstorm and provide their own ideas about the research that we're conducting. And then we all share our responses as a group and then set priorities by voting on which are the highest priority and then making a group decision that is reached through consensus. And so this is just the method that we use. I just wanted to point out step two. So what we did with our LTAR Advisory Council was shared our common experiment research with them. So that included treatments and measurements. And so at the meeting, the advisory council members were asked to identify most useful, least useful, and missing treatments and measurements. And from that, with everyone's responses, we came up with a list of priorities by combining the most useful treatments with the missing treatments to identify what is a priority as a group. And so we did this using our Miro whiteboard sticky notes, and we used a round robin style method where each advisory council member had a chance to share their information before we discussed it as a group. Again, these are like the details that mostly providing a visual for you here. I guess I will point out that in terms of least useful treatments and measurements, there were not really any. So that to us is a good indicator that we're being resourceful. Missing pieces, this is where people got a chance to open up their imagination and provide different ideas that maybe we hadn't been considering or hadn't been investigating yet or had investigated in the past, but kind of opening up the floor to a wider group of ideas. And then in the priority process, we grouped the different responses based on theme and had the advisory council members vote on which of the themes that they thought were most important. And so the front runners, which were different kinds of economic data and climate smart agriculture, are what we as a group decided were the two highest research priorities. And I also put this in a table if that's easier to read, but the idea is that we achieved consensus about research priorities. Okay, so what's the point? The point is that there are rapid changes in agriculture happening that need to be addressed maybe sooner than a long-term plan. So how do we do that? We can use activities like the nominal group technique and priority setting to identify areas that are most important to pursue over other avenues to help us direct our resources effectively. It's also methodologically a way to incorporate data. The information that stakeholder advisory council members contribute to the research process. So that adds rigor in any scientific research study where we have a group of experts that have expanded the subject matter of what we're working on for a research project together. Yes, this is also an opportunity for trust building and continuing to build relationships with stakeholders by staying engaged with them throughout this process. So I've been the primary facilitator of the advisory council during my postdoc, and it's always been a pleasure to communicate with advisory council members outside of our twice-a-year meetings. It does require a level of reciprocity so that we make sure that our science isn't extractive and only asking for something, getting it, and then leaving. And then we also, by collaborating, have research products that have been informed by our target audience, hopefully making them more adoptable. Okay, I have a second example, but what time is it?
About 4:10.
Okay. I'll ask if anyone has questions about the nominal group technique, this method, before moving on. Also, let me know if there's online. I already said that, okay. So I have another example. It's more complicated. So I'm going to skirt over some things. Don't worry about it. I have some points that I'm going to make to show you how different methods contribute different types of information and how different methods produce different information that you can compare across time and space. Okay, so one of LTAR's scientific initiatives is to develop a sustainability indicator framework, which allows an operation to assess the performance of their business. And so why do we need this? Some scientists in the network, when talking, realized that they wanted a way to address trade-offs between different systems and look at regional differences and be able to have data that contributes at different scales. What is an aspirational system that makes an operation more sustainable? This is an illustrative example of an indicator framework. So on the outside of a circle, you see 3 domains. So within this framework, we have the environmental domain, social domain, and economic domain that then have their own attributes within the framework. So I cannot read this. Within the social domain, we have social cohesion and human health, which are then measured by different indicators. So as an example of human health, one indicator would be worker safety. And this is the same model, but in wheel format, as we call it. So you can see on the outside, we have the domains. On the inside is the operation, and then the attributes of the domain and the indicators for the attributes. So what I really want to focus on is talking about when you ask a group of stakeholders about what are indicators of sustainability, we're going to have wildly different responses. So what we wanted to do was present a part of this framework to the stakeholders and ask them what are the indicators that they think are important for including to assess the performance of their operation. So for example, throughout years of discussion to come up with this indicator wheel, LTAR scientists have established, let's see, financial strength and stability of profits as appropriate indicators to determine financial stability. And that falls within an economic domain. So we wanted to know if our stakeholders didn't know what was in these circles, what would they fill it in as? So that's what I'm going to show you. So this is a table format. It's going to be quite a bit of text, and don't worry about reading it. I'll point out a couple of things. So we presented and explained the domains and the attributes. As you can see here, the indicators are blank. And so each stakeholder had the opportunity to write up to 4 indicators. What they think are high priority indicators for atmospheric health. And then we filled in their responses to this table. So these are things that, without knowing the existing indicators, the advisory council came up with as a group, independently and as a group. And then now these cells that are shaded represent indicators that were voted as a top 4 to be included that were not initially in the original brainstorm. So when stakeholders were able to see the original indicators and consider the advisory council ideas with the existing indicators, they still prioritized some of the original indicators, even if it wasn't all of them, or it was just in some instances. And so now the indicators that I've highlighted are what we have in common. So this is what advisory council members think are high priority indicators that were also in the original framework that they identified. And so why am I talking about all of this? Because we can see where we have common ground with stakeholders and where we differ. And so the point of this exercise, part of the point, is that working together, we created an adapted indicator framework that was relevant to local priorities and also informed by the scientific expertise of the LTAR scientists who put it together. So each group independently would not have been able to develop this, but together we have created and interpreted a context-specific indicator framework. Okay, so thinking about everything that I've talked about, so up to this point, the different elements of co-production of knowledge and stakeholder engagement. I just wanted to reiterate again, different folks have different kinds of knowledge and different priorities. And when we work together, we can really do amazing things. We really can. And this example, the indicator framework, it points out that scientists can identify blind spots for stakeholders, and stakeholders can identify blind spots for research scientists. Okay, I think I've talked about most of this. Okay, so now I have a couple of wrap-up slides. If you're wondering, oh my God, there's no way I could do that, this lady is crazy. I promise you, you can. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be a social scientist to engage stakeholders meaningfully. But maybe you should know before you get into it that things will always change, even within the research process. All of us know that it requires a certain level of flexibility. If we weren't flexible, we wouldn't be scientists. Also, just some of the practical considerations are meeting as an advisory council and research team. There is some literature that suggests that there are differences in learning outcomes in hybrid virtual and in-person contexts. So based on your field, I guess, the context, making sure that you're selecting an appropriate venue because they all have their trade-offs. Also, this is a long-term commitment. It's not a one and done kind of situation. So it does require a lot of planning because of that, to make sure that that is included in the plan from the start. I also wanted to point out that we are defining whose voices matter when we decide who to invite to the table to help us make these decisions. And so we can use social science sampling techniques to recruit experts that we know will provide meaningful input into the research process, but there are always going to be groups that can't make it, groups that aren't interested in it, that are not included in this co-production of knowledge. So there's always going to be that limitation. And I see this a lot. Co-production and engaging stakeholders is not always rewarded. It's not something that you can put on your CV to say, yes, this is something that I did. And so because of that, it is often not prioritized, or is only prioritized when it's required. And so thinking about future directions of research, what we really want to know is, can stakeholder engagement strengthen network science? So if we can increase engagement across all 19 LTAR sites and have some kind of uniform process, will we be able to identify these pathways that we've talked about of decision making? And then that would also, well, I'll back up. Co-production of science is kind of the wild, wild west in the literature. And so one thing that we need in this area are explanatory models that can tell us why a certain engagement strategy produces a specific outcome. And I do believe that we can do that as an LTAR network. And part of the way that we're doing that is through our engagement working group. So I co-lead it with one of my colleagues, Taylor Ulbrich from Michigan State University. And we meet once a month and we are putting together a co-production toolkit. I think we had a meeting yesterday. It's 60 pages long. We're not a short-winded group, but we want to provide a practical resource to folks who want to engage stakeholders so that they know what they're getting into and they get into it responsibly, because there are a lot of considerations. And that is all I have in terms of my presentation. I did want to acknowledge the USDA for this funding. However, any opinions, findings, conclusion, or recommendations expressed in my presentation thank you for the photos from Carlton Ward. Thank you to Taylor again, who helped me think through some of these ideas. Our advisory council, of course, and the entire engagement working group, which keeps me thinking about how to improve engagement on the daily. Thanks. Yes, Hillary.
Well, I'll start by stating the obvious. I think having you here has transformed our ability to think about the impacts of our research. I'd like to give you a shout out there, because having someone who thinks in a substantial way has really made a big difference, certainly for me, and I hope for others. I would say a couple of reflections I would make on your talk. I still believe that agriculture is a or agro-ecosystem, agro-ecological research is a very long way ahead in this thinking than our conservation biology research. And, you know, agriculture has been much more attuned to outcomes in their research. And of course, conservationists want to make sure that their data are, use the phrase, useful, usable, and used. But I think we're behind the curve in conservation biology. So I like the leadership coming out of agriculture to encourage us to think that way. I think the other thing is, one of the things that was very quite notable for me was, of course, the pain of having to sit still and not say anything and listen to stakeholders deciding on what you should do. Very good lesson for Hillary Swain. But I was so delighted when they kind of came up with the same things that we were prioritizing. So, for example, our stakeholders told us that work on climate and work on climate smart agriculture and carbon was really important to them, our stakeholder community across the board, agriculture and conservation. And that was something that they were very keen to get out. You know, it's hard, you know, one can always question the political milieu of this, but it was very clear to me that that came out as a resoundingly important factor for them. And these are working producers, not sort of government agencies that are arguing to us. So I just want to say that despite the research angst of, you know, listening to someone determining what you should be doing, it's really reassuring when they come up with the same answers, or sometimes better ones or different ones that you hadn't thought of. So thanks for that insight.
Thanks, Hillary. Yes.
How did you go about professionally establishing boundaries with these stakeholders, with these essentially strangers?
So the question is, how did I establish boundaries with virtual strangers? Luckily, they weren't strangers. I had Betsy, I had Hillary, I had Jean, making these connections and basically being like a member of the community that vouched for me. And like, that's a pretty common technique used in social science sampling, where you're trying to work with a group that is kind of hard to get to, is finding what is called a key informant, someone who can vouch for you and say, this person is well-meaning, they want to work with you on science, I think that you should hear them out. Yes, Karen.
There's like a spectrum of like researchers and stakeholders. So there's two questions. Where do you see on that spectrum, like the Archbold UF alliance? And do you think that's a good place for it to be, or do you wish it kind of would move one way or the other?
Yeah, let me find it. So the question was about this continuum and where do I think Archbold and UF are, and do I think that that's a good place for us to be? So I would place us at the level of co-production. We do have some level of shared decision-making when it comes to deciding what research avenues we're going to pursue. And I didn't have an opportunity to get too into it, but we actually have spent a lot of time talking about virtual fence technology. And that led to writing virtual fence technology into a grant when we otherwise wouldn't have. Which also just introduces another variable, which is, do you have funding to pursue the ideas that stakeholders are prioritizing? And do I think this is a good place for us to be? Yes. I do. I've mentioned that we've been meeting as an advisory council for the last 3 years. That is a long time to have made a lot of progress and still have a lot to do. Because co-production, it doesn't start or end absolutely. I really would have liked to do something with this degree of collaboration abacus where we actually collected data and analyzed it and interpreted it as an advisory council and research scientist team. I really wish I would have been able to do that, and we made a lot of progress towards that. And I'm hoping to leave an appropriate setup for Archbold to continue to be successful at the engagement, even when I move to a new position. Shafali.
I have a related question to that. I guess before we officially started the stakeholder advisory council, where would you have put the Archbold you have submitted?
Okay, so before the advisory council, where would I have put Archbold on this continuum? Well, my initial response is I have no idea. I really don't, because I don't know what level of engagement was happening. I know that, from what I've gleaned, because I've never asked this question of Betsy or Hillary, that they were at the stakeholder consultation, definitely more than stakeholder informed, but Archbold is like a huge member of the community in Buck Island Ranch and has a presence at the Florida Cattlemen's Association meeting every year. So if I had to pick somewhere, I do believe that Archbold was at least at the consultation, but I mean, that's also complicated by working at a ranch, having a working cattle ranch. A lot of that kind of puts us more towards stakeholder participation if we include them as ranchers and participators. Yeah, that's my opinion.
I think you're being generous.
Oh, okay.
I would say the problem is that we were doing those things, but not in any formal process. So we might have been lying in those areas, but there was absolutely no documentation of this. Or Betsy may disagree with me, but it just wasn't a formal process. So I think we were in the, in those areas, but if you asked us to write it up, or what have we done? We have zippity doo dah about that. Other than we used to write down what meetings did we attend, all of this sort of thing as evidence of stakeholder engagement, rather than, well, it was just informal.
Yeah. So Hillary just pointed out that the engagement happening prior to the advisory council was informal, and one advantage of the advisory council was we were able to have a formal process to be able to document that. Okay, is there a question online?
We have one question
Yes.
online from Alia. What would success look like for you or LTAR/Archibald at the end of the process?
What does success look like at the end of the process? Success hopes that there's no end to the process. I really hope that it continues. That's a hard question to answer, because in science, sometimes we get a non-significant result. We get no's, something doesn't work. But I think that as long as we're working with an advisory council and developing research together and discovering together that something is not a great solution, still counts as co-produced knowledge. It's still knowledge that we have. So even if we succeed, we make the best research product ever. Everyone downloads this app that we've developed and uses it every day. Like, that is valuable. And I also want to know what doesn't work. So as long as we're still working with stakeholders to ask these questions, to continue our scientific curiosity, that's success. Okay, I think I've gone over time, have I?
4:32.
Yes. Okay, we have at least one more question. We can.
Yeah.
When you define stakeholders, you use the phrase experts, right? Like, they need to be experts. Do you think that potentially limits the efficacy or diversity of your group if you're only including people who are experts in the subject matter?
So the question is about whether or not inviting advisory council members who are experts automatically limits us in the representation. And I use that word very broadly. So I know I said subject matter experts. Some people are. Research scientists on our team are subject matter experts. But I also consider ranchers experts at ranching, and service providers experts at helping their whatever you call them, their customers, I guess, their clients. So yeah, we definitely don't want to exclude anyone just because they're not what we view as traditionally an expert. Okay, we have gone over time, but I will say that I will be hanging out afterwards, and then we're getting dinner at Casa Tequila at 5:30. If anyone has more questions or wants to say goodbye, this is my last visit at Archibald, but I will still be here through the 26th. Please email me, ask me questions. Thank you all for being here.